Okay, hi everyone, and we are back. So, this is the third part of the lecture this week. In the last part of the lecture, I left you with a question that was not this one, but I asked you to look at where you thought what you thought might trigger a nasal vowel versus an oral vowel in English. So, basically, a vowel where we have air coming through our nose versus a vowel where we don't. So basically, a nasal vowel in English will only really occur after a nasal consonant. Or sometimes before a nasal consonant. So basically, the presence of a nasal consonant in English is what triggers a nasal vowel. So I have another quick question for you, to kind of get you thinking again about what might trigger one sound versus another sound, is to look at these two statements and try to think of which of these are true. So in this first one, we have k and ng. So we have the voiceless velar stop, and then we have the velar nasal. So k and ng are in contrastive distribution, so distinct phonemes in English. Or we have those two sounds are in complementary distribution, so are allophones of one phoneme. So what we would want to do here is to think about, are there any words where k and ng occur in the exact same environment and then they are two different words? So if you take some time to think about that, we can kind of come back to it at the end and see if you thought of any and see if you kind of got it right. For now, I will be talking about phonological rules and phonological processes. So this is just kind of showing you a formalized way that linguists will sometimes write down a phonological rule. So basically, if there is a predictable phonological interaction between sounds that's going on, this is the way linguists will tend to write it down. So basically, they'll write down what's called the input right here. So that will be what is the basic underlying phoneme that's changing. And the output will be what does the phoneme change to. So they'll do the input, and then an arrow, and then the output, and that whole thing's what happens. Then a slash, and then they'll put down the conditioning environment, which is where it happens. So for example, we could write down something like a phoneme changing to an allophone of that phoneme. Or the conditioning environment would be something like one type of sound is preceding this, and then the other type of sound is following it. So one example, for example, the language Hoopa, is they have the vowel sound I, which is the underlying phoneme, and it changes to the allophone U. And this happens in the environment of before a labiovelar sound. So I becomes U before labiovelar sounds. We can also see this in English, where we have, for example, the aspirated versus unaspirated P. We could say the regular phoneme P becomes the aspirated P at the beginning of a word. Okay. So these changes that happen are what's called, they basically illustrate phonological processes. These phonological processes, or these changes in allophones, are usually motivated by some kind of phonetic concern or perceptual concern. Basically, these things with aspirated Ps, or with one vowel changing to another, things like that, or the nasal vowels, are motivated primarily by things like making a word more smooth or easier to say, or making it easier for someone to understand what we're saying. So there are kind of reasons that these changes occur. So some of these phonological processes are, like I mentioned, motivated by reasons of making something easier to say. So they basically are trying to minimize how hard it is to say something. So assimilation, for example, is one of these processes. In assimilation, sounds take on properties of adjacent sounds. So in English, we have this sequence of sounds where the underlying phoneme is in. So this the vowel I, and then the consonant n. This sound becomes either im or in or ing in certain environments. So in becomes im in the environment of before another bilabial. So basically, we have the bilabial stop, the p sound, and the in becomes a bilabial nasal rather than an alveolar nasal. So basically, it's becoming more similar to the sound following it. Intolerant basically stays the same because the t is also alveolar and the n just stays alveolar like it would. In the case of incoherent, the regular alveolar nasal becomes a velar nasal. This is because the k in coherent is a velar stop. So basically, the nasal sound in this in prefix tries to become more like the sounds that follow it. We also see this with the plural endings of words. So we have the underlying phoneme z in the English plural, and then this z becomes a s sound or a z sound when it's actually pronounced. So we have the word cat, and then when we have that word, it's a s. And then we have dog. When we have that word, it's a z. If you think a little bit about why that might happen, it's because the t in cat is voiceless. And then the s that we end up adding on as the plural ending also is voiceless. So basically, it's trying to keep voiceless sounds together because sounds that are more alike are easier to pronounce in sequence. So that's the same with dogs. We have the voiced z to go with the voiced g because two voiced sounds are going to be easier to say than mixing the voiced and the voiceless. So palatalization is another phonological process we might see. So this is when we have an alveolar or a velar consonant, and it ends up being pronounced as palatal or alveopalatal. So for example, we have put in the sequence put you up. If we say it quickly enough, we might say put you up. So the t becomes a ch. So we're kind of combining the t and the y. So basically put and you become put you. So we see that with notate and notation. We see that with divide and division. But basically an alveolar or a velar consonant can be pronounced as palatal or alveopalatal when there is another sequence of sounds immediately following it. This, again, is because it's sometimes when we have things like a stop followed by a vowel sound or a stop followed by a glide, it sometimes can be easier to say these sounds when we palatalize them. So basically, this is another one for ease of pronunciation. Lenition is another type of sound change. So lenition is when we have a sound that kind of, quote marks here, a sound that's weakening. There's no real way to define a weak or a strong sound, but one way to put it is that a sound is weakening. So as we say the sound is weakening because it's using less obstruction in a particular context. So basically, it's weakening because it's going from being a stop to becoming something like a fricative. So some examples are we have the Sardinian word baka, which means cow. It becomes sa vaca, so basically a bilabial fricative, which we don't really have in English, but So we have a stop becoming a fricative. We also see this in their word for house, which is damu, and when they have the word for thee before it, the d becomes a fricative the. So when in Sardinian a stop is preceded by the word for thee, it becomes a fricative. And this is again because kind of for perceptual and reasons of kind of pronunciation, it can make these words easier to say by changing the stop to a fricative when there's something just before it. So insertion is another phonological process. In insertion, we have the addition of a sound between two others. And again, this one makes things easier to say, at least in English. We don't frequently say two consonants right next to each other. So if because of making something past tense or a plural, if because of that we might have two consonants right next to each other, we'll actually just insert a vowel in there, and that makes it easier to say too. So wait becomes weighted. So we have that vowel in there because just saying wait and then duh would be pretty hard. Like wait, yeah, it's hard to say, and you can try it if you want to. I just did. But basically, that's another one where it's making things easier to say. Deletion is another one. And again, this is making things more smooth to say. So in English, we have the word him, where there is that N sound, depending on how you say it. So basically, we have the N in him is kind of deleted for most people. But if we say hymnal, then we do say it. So basically, if we have two consonants right next to each other, sometimes we might just delete one of them because that'll make it easier to say. But in the case of hymnal, we can kind of treat it as two different syllables, and it's a lot easier to say it as two different syllables. Same with crumb. We don't really say the B in crumb, but if we have another syllable on there, it can become something like crumble. So deletion is another thing we might do to make things easier to say. Metathesis is another one. So this is when we have sounds are put in the opposite order from how they were originally said or how they're written, things like that. So, for example, there's the English word comfortable, where most of us say it kind of like I did, comfortable. But if we're actually saying it how it was originally said, it would be comfortable. So we see things like that in some names. So a lot of you may have heard of the football player Brett Favre. That's another one where we have the sounds are kind of out of order from how they were originally said. And this is, again, kind of making things easier to say depending on which language you're coming from. Certain sequences of sounds can be easier to say. So this metathesis or sounds going in a different order can happen. So some of the processes that we will see are motivated more by perceptual salience. So what I mean by that is to make sounds more different from each other. So what we saw before was sounds either becoming more similar or sounds just becoming easier to say in general. But sometimes sounds becoming more different from each other can actually be a process that will happen. And again, this is just to make things easier for the listener more so than the speaker. So if the listener can hear the difference, it's easier on them. If it's easier for someone to say, then it's easier on the speaker. So some examples of this are what's called fortition. This is when a sound might become, in a way, stronger. So you might have aspiration at the start of a word, like in English, we have pat versus the P in spit that's not aspirated. So an aspirated sound is kind of more forceful. So having aspiration at the start of a word can enhance the contrast between that word and whatever came before it. Dissimilation is another thing where a sound might change to become less like a nearby sound. So in Finnish, they have this process happening where sometimes the underlying vowel a will become an o vowel when it is in between an a and an e. So basically, that's happening because Finnish would have two a's right next to each other. So having two of the same vowel next to each other would be kind of hard on the listener. So it becomes less like the a. So it goes from being a low vowel to a mid vowel. So another thing we can see is that sometimes a single sound can have two pronunciations in the same word. So this is kind of where allophones don't necessarily have a pattern, but we will have different sounds depending on who's talking. So sometimes we might have aspiration, we might not have aspiration. And in some words, this is just kind of random versus being patterned, like we saw with the aspirated P. So that's just one thing to remember. Free variation isn't something we'll be too concerned with, but it is something that does happen. Okay, so the last little topic, and this will be pretty short, so I'm not going to make a whole new video for it, is something called allomorphy. This is really going to lead us into next week. So next week we're going to start looking at what's called a morpheme, or the smallest bit of a word that has meaning. So allomorphy is kind of a tie between phonology that we're doing this week and morphology for next week. So allomorphy is when there are two affixes in a certain situation in a language that change shape based on the environment. So we have the s at the end of stops, and we have the z at the end of reads. So the s is there because it's preceded by a voiceless consonant. The z is there because it's preceded by a voiced consonant. So this is what's called an alternation, where the affix has changed its form based on what word it's attaching to. So each form of this morpheme, or this smallest bit of meaning, is an allomorph. And the reason we say this little bit of sound has meaning is because it's actually telling us that the word it's attached to is plural. So it is a really small sound, but it actually is telling us something about the meaning of the word. That there's more than one of them in the case of a noun, or that, I guess in the case of these being verbs, that they are in the present tense. So allomorphy is when we basically, just like when we have allophones, it's when we have those processes that trigger the distinctions between two different sounds that are next to each other, also trigger differences between two different morphemes. So this is something we'll see more next week when we start looking at these morphemes, these little bits of meaning. But for now, basically that's what I have for you this week. We've gone through most of the phonological processes. You don't need to necessarily memorize what those are. The main thing I would try to concentrate on this week is that we can have different forms of a sound depending on the environment it is in. And we can have these phonological processes that will change how a word will sound. And they can be motivated by the listener or by the speaker. But just because a sound is changing, or just because a word is changing, doesn't mean someone is using like improper English or anything like that. All it means is that something is changing. There's not necessarily one correct pronunciation we're looking for, or one way to pronounce a word. So basically just try to keep in mind that just depending on the environment, the sounds we hear can change. And if you're having trouble with any of this stuff, make sure to ask questions. I will be putting up a homework assignment that's going to be due later in the semester. It's going to have a few questions on it, including a phonological problem. I will be putting up kind of a tutorial about how to do that problem as well. So look for that at some point in the future. And remember that this week there is a discussion assignment. So make sure you get your first post in by Friday and respond to your classmates by Sunday. So good luck with this week, and let me know if there are questions.